Hey folks, welcome to the round 2 daily recap of the candidates. And the action definitely continued today. We saw Ding Liren unfortunately being dealt his second loss, this time courtesy of MVL. It's clear that Ding Liren is just not in good form. It's possibly, it was reported in the news that he was quarantined for 2 weeks before the tournament. It's quite possible with all that's going on in the world right now, this has just affected him mentally, and he's just not ready to play in his best form at this tournament, which is quite unfortunate. You can't help but feel bad for the guy. Another news, Caruana scored his first win of the tournament, this time against the outsider, Alexeyenko. And Wang Hao came close to winning his second game in a row against Anish Giri, but Giri managed to defend and ultimately save that one. And Nepal and Grischuk drew their game. There was a little bit of fight there, but ultimately neither side could really create any serious chances. I think Grischuk was slightly better with black for most of the game in the Berlin, but ultimately couldn't really make anything out of it. So now we have 4 leaders tied for first with 1.5 points each. It's really anyone's tournament at this point, but Caruana is definitely in good shape, being the tournament favorite going in, and seeing his main rival Ding Liren not doing so well. I would say MVL, Nepo, Wang Hao must be feeling pretty good themselves. So going into the first game here, Caruana against Alexeyenko. This featured a Nimzo Indian, and Fabi goes for the F3 system. This is really one of the sharpest ways facing the Nimzo, and I'm not sure if I've seen Fabi use this one too much. He's mostly an E4 player. He does trot out D4 every once in a while, but he doesn't really have as much experience, I feel like, in these positions as some of the other top players. Nevertheless, he came extremely well prepared. Alexeyenko went for one of the main lines with D5, A3, Bishop E7, E4, takes, and now C5. So this is kind of a trendier move that's become popular in the last couple of years. E5 has long been considered the main line, has a ton more games. But C5 is also an interesting way for black to play the position, just kind of fighting back against white's center in a different way. So the players followed some mainline theory here. Castles, Bishop E2, Knight F3, Bishop G4. And around here at this moment, castles, knight bd7, Fabi plays a new move, d6. Previously, bishop g5 was played in a game earlier this year. D6 appears to be a novelty. And although the engine doesn't really give white any advantage here, it's actually a very good example of the power of using the power of the computer, the preparation, to put your opponent in a position where the best moves are far from obvious. I think this is something that Caruana and his team are particularly good at doing, at finding these chances where the engine just gives 0-0 or even minus 0.10, but they get this feeling that for a human it's kind of hard to navigate these positions. Because here he goes h3, bishop h5, and then knight to b5. And this is kind of where black has to make a pretty serious choice. White is threatening, of course, knight c7 and winning the exchange, would also like to play bishop f4 and supporting the d-pawn. And this position is just hard to navigate for the average human player, who's obviously not an engine and cannot just figure everything out immediately. So Alexeyenko basically immediately goes wrong with rook to e6. I believe Stockfish was giving rook to b8 as the best move here, which, yeah, it's kind of hard to play over the board. You have to understand that it's not exactly possible for white to take the a7 pawn. Then after something like bishop f4, black can play a6. And if knight c7, rook e4, black is actually doing quite well here. So instead, white would probably have to jump back with knight to c3, and then the situation is approximately balanced. This d6 pawn is strong, but it is blockaded, and black has a good piece play, is able to get most of his pieces out, in particular the light square bishop. It's kind of important for black that it's out on h5 and in the game, and not kind of sitting at home on c8. But instead, Alexeyenko plays the move rook to e6 here, and then after bishop f4, a6, and knight c7, plays the move rook e4. Probably this was his idea from before, willing to sacrifice in exchange in order to take this bishop on f4. And so it wouldn't have been very good for white to grab this one. Then black could take the bishop here and has ideas, for instance, of playing bishop takes f3, followed by rook d4, picking up this d6 pawn, and then black would have some very healthy compensation for the exchange. Instead, Caruana finds a better move. He goes bishop h2, just kind of keeping the initiative. Queen d2 I think was also strong, defending the bishop this way. This gives black time to play the move rook to c8, but now Fabi goes g4. A really sharp move. I think this ended up working out quite well for him. The point is that if black goes back bishop g6, then after bishop d3, for example, the rook is really just kind of running short on squares here. Rook e3, takes, queen to d2, rook e4, rook a d1, and white is just completely dominating the position. Black has zero plans, zero prospects. White has ideas of either knight g5 or pushing g5. This d6 pawn is incredibly strong. The f7 pawn is going to be a target with white's rook lined up on the f-file, and black is just basically lost here. I mean, the pieces have zero activity whatsoever. So Alexyenko does the right practical thing here. He ends up sacrificing on g4, and then after takes, knight takes g4, bishop d3. He takes on h2, bishop e4, knight f1, queen takes f1, and we get a situation after takes, knight d5, where white is a piece up for 3 pawns, so material-wise black is doing okay, but white's extra piece here is really powerful, especially with the presence of queens on the board, as this means that white basically has an extra piece to try and create attacking chances against black's king. And from here, Caruana plays a very good game. He simply starts bringing his pieces to the king side, and black is, I would say, already very close to losing in a practical game, probably just lost. Here, for instance, after f5, white could just sacrifice on f5, open up black's king, giving back the extra piece, but creating just this huge attack, especially with king f2, and then the rook coming to g1 next. In the game, instead, black played king g7, and white actually had a funny opportunity here to play this move bishop f5. A very unusual sacrifice, but because of the pressure against the knight on d7, black is kind of forced to take, and then after king f2, followed by rook to g1, black's king is basically going to be under huge fire. Now, this wasn't really necessary in the game. Fabi just goes king h1, and just starts bringing his pieces in, knight h4 here, rook to g1, and it's really a matter of time before white is able to kind of crash through here, and he really just has no issues. Knight f4, knight to g4 was played, otherwise the h5 pawn was hanging sacrifices on g6 looming as well. And here Fabi finds a pretty simple combination, takes, bishop f5, hitting the rook as well as hitting this knight on g4. White is given the piece back, but is about to totally break through on the g-file, and black is basically busted here. Bishop e7 was played, bishop g4, hg, queen takes g4, bishop g5, and one final moment that I felt was instructive here. Rather than just taking the piece and going into this endgame with an extra piece where for sure white is winning with the extra knight, this would still require some technical work, and I think black would be justified in playing on here to try and trade off all the pawns and reach a drawn endgame. But instead, Fabi just plays the simple move queen to h5, keeping his attacking chances on the board, hoping to take on g5 with the rook, after which black's king is just going to get mated. And if something like f6 here, then after knight f5 check, the king is just running into huge trouble. King f8 check and queen h7 check, followed by either queen to g7 as well as rook e1 coming, and the king is just not escaping from this mating net. So a very, very nice game by Caruana. I would say this is almost typical Fabi. He comes up with a very interesting idea in the opening, poses problems for the opponent, and then is able to just tactically find the problem with his opponent's responses to the preparation. So really high quality game from the tournament favorite. The next decisive game came in the game of MVL versus Ding Liren, and yeah, Ding Liren's troubles simply continued kind of in a surprising fashion. I mean, they played a classical Ruy Lopez here, which is one of Ding Liren's specialties. He plays these positions quite a bit, and the players go down a pretty topical line here with white playing this move a3. The point of this one is to eventually bring the knight to c3 and then not have to worry about knight a5, as the bishop will be able to drop back to a2. Queen d7, knight c3, rook e8. Ding Liren has had this position a couple of times already in his career. Here MVL plays bishop to d2. This move is typically connected with supporting white's queenside play and sets up ideas like knight to d5. Knight d8 was played, knight d5, knight takes d5, e takes d5. This one looks a little bit strange positionally in order to shut down white's bishop, but it is also kind of blocking black's bishop on b7 as well. Black tried c5 here. I think this is still following some theory, which is a good move. If white takes on passant, then black is able to just get all of his pieces back into the game. But this d5 pawn is not only restricting the bishop, it is also greatly restricting black's knight on d8. So MVL just plays the move a4 and just keeps this pawn on d5 to fully restrict black's pieces. So here Ding Liren makes a pretty huge blunder and plays the move f5. And by the way, if you guys want to see a detailed analysis of this game and what happened here, make sure to check out Grandmaster Jesse Kry's Move of the Day videos that he's doing for ChessDojo. These are really instructive, and basically just takes one move or one decision and breaks it down in a lot of depth. And I highly recommend that he goes through the rest of this game in really interesting fashion. Long story short, the reason this move is a blunder is actually quite deep here. After AB, rook takes a8, bishop takes a8, and c4, kind of a thematic idea that ends up causing a lot of problems for black. Number one, b takes c4 is bad due to bishop a4, and white wins not just an exchange but actually a full rook here on e8. And if black tries a move like rook to f8, for example, just trying to get out of this potential skewer, white takes on b5, and after queen takes b5, has knight takes e5. This really just game-busting tactic where black is just immediately lost. D takes e5, d6, the bishop on e7 is lost, and white is just completely winning. So f5 is a blunder because the pawn on e5 really needed support. Previously, f6 had been played in, I think, a couple of correspondence games, and here, of course, in the same line, white doesn't have this knight takes e5 trick, and so white's advantage is really limited to a minimum here. Well, after f5, I think MVL's technique was quite good. Black played knight f7 here because, again, after rook f8 or such moves, white just takes on b5. Here he takes on b5 as well because queen takes b5 would just run into bishop a4. And this means that white has basically pawn up now, can really just solidify everything with bishop to c4, and is just doing fantastic. Black's bishop on a8 is still kind of shut out of the game. So Ding Liren tried to fight back, he pushes g5, but I really liked MVL's technique here. He just restricts his opponent from being able to create anything. King g6, kind of a funny move here, trying to play h5 and get some pawns going on the king side. I mean, what else is black going to do? But white just shuts everything down with g4, and MVL was able to win this one quite handedly. Once again, if you want to see a full analysis of this game, make sure to check out Jesse's Move of the Day video. Next up, we have Wang Hao versus Anish Giri. This game took place in symmetrical English, and the opening in this one was quite interesting. Here, Giri plays a pretty topical move e6. Usually the idea of this one is to bring the knight to e7 and then follow up with either d6 or d5. And here Hao tries h4, knowing that since black wants to put the knight on e7, the knight is not coming out to f6, and this will give white some opportunities to play h5 and create some immediate pressure on the h-file. So Giri, I think, responds quite well here with h6. The players are still following theory, so I imagine they were both in their book here, although I think Wang Hao was already spending a couple minutes on this move h4, so maybe this was him remembering his prep, maybe it was a little bit of over-the-board improvisation, maybe a little bit of both. But anyway, he goes d4 here, which is a pretty thematic pawn sacrifice and also the main line in the position. After c takes d4, knight to b5, white's idea is to try to win this pawn back on d4. And once white is able to win the pawn back, he can try to claim a small advantage based on the structure. Black plays d5, c takes d5, e takes d5, and now if white is able to win the pawn back on d4, he's going to be able to play against this IQP. Now I feel like Wang Hao actually gave Anish some opportunities here after castles queen to c1. Very ambitious move. I mean, he's threatening the h6 pawn immediately, and he still wants to take back on d4. Here the engine thinks black should have just played bishop to g4, just kind of ignoring all of white's ideas and just focusing on development, trying to play rook to c8 next with a bunch of activity. If white takes on d4, for example, then after knight takes d4, knight takes d4, and knight e4, black is actually getting a ton of activity in the position and already is probably stealing the initiative here with the knight hanging on d4, rook to c8 coming, and of course this e2 pawn also kind of potentially hanging if the knight on d4 gets out of the way. But you know, this is kind of computer stuff. Giri ends up playing, say, a more human move, a6, but it does kind of waste the valuable tempo, as white did want to take on d4 anyway. Well, Wang Hao ends up taking on d4, knight takes d4, king h7, defending the h6 pawn, and now white just gets a very pleasant position, especially after the move queen to c7, which I find quite instructive, just going for the endgame and trying to make full use of black's IQP here on d5. After a few more moves, I think white's advantage here just stays minimal, but it's what we would call a lasting edge, where unless black can somehow get rid of his IQP, he's always just going to be slightly worse here. And after a couple of nice improving moves here, Wang Hao eventually ends up trading the dark squared bishops and gets the situation where he can simply grind and try to improve against the d5 pawn. Now ultimately black's position is solid, but these are the types of positions that are very difficult to hold because black simply has very little counterplay. White can slowly build up, and as soon as black gives any opportunity, white can kind of pounce on it and eventually get a very pleasant endgame. And that's kind of what happens here. b5, a3, rook b8, knight e2. Black played a5 here, knight d4, bishop d7, and here white plays b4, and I think this position is already very problematic for black. After ab, this pawn on b5 is basically stuck and fixed as a weakness. Of course, the d5 pawn is another long-term weakness, and white's pieces are just very, very well placed here. As soon as white is able to get his rooks to the c-file and play something like rook c5, it's going to be quite difficult for black. But white is also threatening moves like rook a2, so black cannot hold all of the files, as a rook has to be covering the b5 pawn. I think what Giri should have done was play b4 back in this position before white had a chance to play b4 himself. It's possible he didn't like the response a4, where white fixes the b5 square and keeps this pressure on the queen side, but after something like knight to c8, he can threaten to play the move knight to b6, hitting the a4 pawn as well as the c4 square. And if white plays the move b3 here, well, it stops white's knight from being able to use this square and attack black's a pawn, but it also gives black a square on c3, which kind of gives him enough counterplay to hold the position. So I think this one would still be pretty drawish. Instead, after b4, white is able to fix another weakness in the position. Giri tries rook a8 with a tactical justification. If white is taking on b5 here, he'll go rook b7 and try to win back the pawn on b4. But Wang Hao simply defends the b4 pawn ahead of time. Now b5 is potentially hanging. Rook a4 was played, rook db1 defending the pawn again, and now black is really forced to defend the pawn by making his rook kind of passive with rook to b7, which allows white to take the c-file. So really good technique from Wang Hao in this game. He just needed a little bit more towards the end to actually try and convert this one into a win. Here Giri decides not to wait for him to play rook c5, tries to create some activity right away, which allows white to pick up this pawn, and he simply has a nearly winning position here. I mean, the engine is already giving something like +2 here, but over the board it's a lot harder to convert than some other +2 positions, as black is able to at least keep the pawn blockaded. So the plan white ends up choosing here is to play bishop to d3 and push e4, which allows black to exchange off his last weakness in the position, but at the same time also helps white improve the bishop. I'm not sure if this one was totally necessary for white. Maybe he could have waited for a little bit before committing to this. Another idea is to have pushed g4 in this situation, where either black takes on g4 and allows white to create an outside passer with h5, or black has to sit and wait, where white would one day be able to take gh5, push f4, and unleash his bishop on the h5 pawn. So maybe this would have given white slightly better chances to win. But anyway, in the game we end up getting this position where this is probably where Wang Hao kind of releases his final winning chances. He goes rook to d7 here, rook c3, and rook b7. He opts to trade these rooks, and the computer finds some small chances, but I think from the human point of view, his position was better before, and here black is able to really just put all of his pieces on the perfect squares. the knight is blocking the passed pawn, the rook is active, and now the king is active as well, and it's very difficult for white to create something, and pretty soon the game was drawn. I think his last chance was maybe around here. Rather than going rook d7, rook b7, the engine suggests rook d3, trying to trade off black's active rook, where if Giri were to oblige, this position I think would give white a lot more opportunities, as black isn't able to kind of get the same setup as in the game. It would still take a lot of work to win this one, but one key point here is, for example, knight d6, king to e3. It's very difficult for black to actually capture this pawn, as this is always going to be running into rook b2 stuff, and the pin on the b file is going to be quite difficult. So black kind of has to sit and wait. White can start improving the rook with things like rook to c2, slowly push the king back, rook c5 check, f4 for example, and if white is able to bring the king over to the queen side, maybe to b4 and start supporting his b-pawn, I think white's winning chances would be quite serious here. So definitely a small mischance for Wang Hao. I think he would have been very excited to start off 2-0. It would also have been 0-2 for Giri, so definitely a lucky save for him, and I'm sure he's happy to actually have a half point on the board. And our final game of the day was between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Alexander Grischuk. Actually, these guys had a pretty interesting handshake that went viral, where they didn't actually shake each other's hands but gave each other the elbow bump, which is now becoming a quite popular way of greeting each other without spreading germs. And these guys go into a Berlin endgame. Kind of a surprising choice in my opinion from Jan, because he is known as a very sharp and tactical player, whereas in these Berlin endgames, if white is going to get anything, it really takes a very subtle positional touch. Not that he's not a good endgame player, but in my opinion doesn't quite seem to fit his style. And in the game, he really just ends up getting nothing. The players follow one of these theoretical lines, rook h6, rook fe1, and here black simply goes bishop b4, a3, and just grabs this knight on c3, spoils white structure on the queen side. Now strategically the pawns are of course weak, but at the same time there is some benefit to having the pawn set up on this way, as it's going to be very difficult for black to create a passed pawn with this 4 versus 3. That said, black's blockade on the light squares is definitely no joke, and if anything I think black is the one that's slightly better here. So jumping forward ahead a little bit to this position, I think Grischuk definitely outplays Jan a little bit here, and in this situation this was kind of his last chance to create some real winning chances with the move knight to e7, trying to maneuver the knight to d5. The tactical point here is after rook e4, knight d5, bishop d2, black has knight takes c3 and winning a pawn, as the rook is hanging on e4, knight is about to be hanging on g5, and some situation like this, g4, rook g6, black would be a pawn up. The winning chances are not super clear, as of course we have the presence of opposite colored bishops, but with an extra pawn it's only black that can be better here, and with rooks on the board of course the game is far from over. So this was kind of Grischuk's last chance. Of course again this was move 28, so he was probably in a pretty heavy time pressure here. He ends up playing knight d8 and knight to e6, and we end up getting the same opposite colored bishops endgame, but where black has not won a pawn, and here black's winning chances were very, very slim. Nepo continues, I think, quite accurately here. He leaves the bishop on g5 to cover the d8 square, and then he simply sets up a trade of all the rooks with this move rook to d8, probably the most technical way to force a draw. And things were soon liquidated, and the players agreed to a draw right at move 40, which is when they're officially allowed to offer draws based on the tournament's Sofia no draw rules. So yeah, taking another look at the standings, definitely very exciting round as well. Hopefully Ding Liren is able to find his form, as he's playing white against Fabiano Caruana tomorrow. Now before the tournament we would consider this to be one of the absolute biggest matchups, one of the biggest rounds, and it's kind of now or never for Ding Liren. If he loses another game, then it's probably just over for his chances, but if he wins, then he basically just blows the tournament wide open, as well, he'll be taking down one of his main rivals. He'll still be at -1, but at least he'll be able to be one step closer to catching up to everyone else. That finishes it up for this video. If you enjoyed the analysis, please make sure to subscribe to the new channel and drop a like or a thumbs up on the video. It really helps the channel grow and lets us know that you're appreciating the content. Hope you guys are staying healthy and have a great rest of your day. Take care.